Have you ever walked into an ancient church, looked up at the soaring domes, felt the sacredness enveloping it, and suddenly felt your heart stop? Have you ever wondered beneath the stones you are walking on, beneath the church floor, polished by centuries of prayers and tears, what secrets lie dormant? Not secrets written in books nor vague legends, but silent fragments of truth, covered by time, decaying silent, but still refusing to disappear. Beneath the ground, among the layers of coffins and tombstones, there on the bodies of people who once wore crowns, who once shook the continent. And among them, there is a woman who once held the fate of an empire. Her name is Elizabeth Tudor, or, as people call her, by a name that is both proud and lonely, Elizabeth of Fichbars, the Virgin Queen, the last of the Tudor dynasty. She is not only a political symbol, but also a cultural symbol, a figure associated with a glorious era of England. In the eyes of her subjects, she is the light in the darkness, the one who steered the country's ship through the storm, the one who made the unthinkable, defeating the Spanish Armada, bringing the country into the era of Shakespeare of art, of ocean exploration, and of expanding the empire. But at the deepest level of this story, what is most chilling is not her exploits in life, but what happened after her death. This is not a story about a throne, but a coffin. Not about glory, but about darkness. Not about life and triumph, but about death imprisoned in silence and the smell of decay. When an ordinary person dies, they are remembered by family, friends, a few photographs, and warm memories. But when a queen dies, especially a queen like Elizabeth, death is not just an end, but a ritual full of anxiety and obsession. For beneath the velvet, beneath the sealed metal, lies a body that its owner once feared. Elizabeth did not fear assassination, did not fear rebellion, did not fear standing alone in a scheming court. But she feared what came after her last breath, the disintegration, the violation, the exposure of the body that had been the inviolable symbol of a dynasty. And so, the story of Elizabeth I's death begins not with a solemn scene, but with a chilling whisper from beneath the cold stone. Let me meet God whole. It was the final plea of a queen who knew all too well what death in court was like. No tenderness, no humane ritual, just scalpels, cold hands, and callous, ruthless pragmatism. The story that follows will take you deep into the crypt, where light cannot penetrate, where time is no longer a flow, but a layer of dust covering the truth. There you will no longer see a majestic Elizabeth on the throne, but an Elizabeth with her chest slit, her organs removed, and her body stuffed with spices, just to prevent her from exploding at her own funeral. Are you ready? Because this story is not for those who want to hear about exploits. It is for those who dare to face the truth, that not even a queen can escape the last law of man, decay. Elizabeth is more than a name in history books. She is a living symbol of an era, the last glorious image of the Tudor dynasty before history turned a new page. People called her by many names. Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the Queen of Light. But all those titles were just people's attempts to capture a part of the light from the woman who once illuminated all of Europe with her intelligence and cold-hearted determination. During her 44 years on the throne, she not only governed a country in the midst of fierce political upheavals, but also steered it through countless challenges to become a force to be reckoned with. Under her reign, England was no longer a nation divided by religion or succession wars. She stood firm amid court intrigues, foreign powers, and even assassination plots. When Spain, then the greatest European power, launched its massive armada to invade England, Elizabeth turned the threat into an opportunity. She did not retreat, did not seek peace, but stood before her troops, with words like the iron that forged a nation, stirring hearts with loyalty. The armada was defeated, England survived and rose, and from then on, Elizabeth I's name was inextricably linked to the pride and independence of a people. She also laid the foundations for what has come to be known as the Golden Age of England, a period when art, literature, and seafaring exploration reached their peak. William Shakespeare, Francis Drake. These legendary figures emerged from her shadow, from an era of intellectual light and exploration. But beneath the makeup and the calm exterior behind the crown and royal robes, Elizabeth was still human. And like everyone else, she was afraid. Her greatest fear was not the sword nor failure in politics, but death. Death for Elizabeth was not simply an end point, but a terrifying journey that she could not control. She had witnessed too many deaths around her, from betrayed relatives to executed enemies. And of all she had witnessed, what haunted her most was not the moment the soul left the body, but what happened to the body afterwards. She feared that her body, which had once represented power, divinity, and an entire dynasty, would one day be torn apart, opened up, and rotted like everyone else. It was a silent fear that haunted her throughout her reign, like a shadow always lurking behind the light of royalty. And it was from that fear that the story became complete, because it made the great queen more relatable than ever. In the 16th century, death was not the graceful and dignified thing we think of today. It did not come with a gentle farewell or a candlelight vigil in a sacred space. Instead, death, especially that of a royal person, was a cold, violent, and harsh process carried out by hands that were accustomed to knives and the smell of death. In that era, sentimentality was seen as weakness. Emotions were suppressed in ritual, and the body, even if it had once belonged to a great man, was reduced to an object to be disposed of neatly and efficiently. The mummification process was not as sacred as it seemed. It was a radical violation of the body of a once divine person. The body was laid on a cold stone table like a lifeless mass of flesh. A scalpel tore open the chest and abdomen, pulling out each internal organ, heart, liver, intestines, stomach. All were removed, not to preserve life, but to prevent what people feared most, the stench of decomposition. The hollow body was stuffed with strong spices like cloves, myrrh, cinnamon, and resin, to deceive the senses of the living, to hide the simple and sad truth that everyone will rot. Elizabeth. I understood this well. Even though she was queen, even though she had commanded thousands of people deep down, she feared the moment when she would no longer be herself. No longer an admired figure, but just a body cut up and stuffed like everyone else. She prayed not with panic, but with a simple, pitiful hope that she could leave this world intact, that she would meet God in the same body that had accompanied her through so many years, as a human and as a king. She did not want to be cut up, did not want to be filled with things that did not belong to her. She wanted to go as she had lived, whole, untouched, uncontrolled. But power is only a temporary cloak that one puts on over the body, and when death comes, that cloak falls. Those who once bowed before her now only obeyed her orders. They were no longer subjects, but doctors, healers, servants, and they did what they thought was necessary. The Queen's last plea, though sincere and filled with fear, was as fleeting as her last breath. No one listened, or if they did not have the courage to break with convention. And so, the body of the woman who had ruled an era was cut open, her organs pulled out from where they belonged, and strange, insensitive things stuffed in. It is the cruelest truth of all, that when we die, our reputations and our power are no longer enough to protect us from what we fear most. For Elizabeth, it was not just a failure of her will, but a sad testament to the fate of all men. No matter how noble in the end, they cannot escape the silence of the cold, practical hand of death. Elizabeth Theate's embalming was not a sacred ritual or a form of honoring the dead, but a series of urgent, cold, and haunting actions, all aimed at preventing something terrible from happening in the midst of a state funeral. As her last breath faded, her body, once considered sacred, majestic, and untouchable, became a problem that needed to be solved as quickly as possible. The grim reality began in the embalming chamber, where she was placed on a cold stone slab, as if her fate was waiting. Her chest was slashed open with long, sharp blades, without care, without permission. It was the work of men trained to be insensitive, to treat a queen's body like any other corpse, an object to be disassembled, cleaned and sealed before it began to give off the signs no one wanted to face. Her heart, liver, stomach, intestines, every vital organ of life were removed. The things that had carried pain, joy, feasts, and history-changing decisions were pulled out piece by piece, set aside like dead machine parts. The empty body was then stuffed with precious spices, cinnamon cloves, myrrh, resin, sometimes even musk or eucalyptus. But make no mistake, this was not a final tribute to the deceased. These fragrant substances were not meant to soothe the soul or glorify the glorious past, but were simply a covering to hide the decay that was quietly beginning from within. All to slow down the inevitable truth that even a queen will decay. The reason for all this was both practical and terrifying, to prevent the body from exploding. It may sound like a horror story, but it was a grim reality in the history of royal funerals. As the organs began to decompose, gases would build up in the abdominal cavity, causing the body to swell like a balloon. If not handled properly, the corpse could suddenly explode, spewing the stench of death blood and fluids everywhere, right as thousands of mourners paid their respects. It would be more than a medical accident, but a symbolic disaster that would tarnish the image of a dynasty and cause widespread horror. And it was because of this fear that the embalmers had to work hastily, carefully, but not without brutality. They could not let a state funeral, where thousands of eyes were watching the magnificent coffin move across the Thames, turn into a gruesome moment where the coffin exploded and the Queen's body was thrown before the people. Although no one dared to say it out loud, that fear lingered in the air like a ghost hovering over every step of the funeral procession. And so, by all means, they tried to keep the decaying body from exploding. What happened in the embalming chamber was never recorded in detail, but the signs that followed, from the unusually sweet scent emanating from the coffin to the unusual bulges in the velvet covering, suggested that the process was borderline. A horror story had almost happened. And if it had, English history might have ended with a bang that no one wanted to remember. But the coffin did not explode, at least not in the presence of anyone. And so, it was assumed all was well, but deep inside the lead, The smell of death still seeped through the cracks, a reminder that even the most powerful cannot conceal the decaying nature of flesh when death has come knocking at the door. After the gruesome process of embalming was completed, Elizabeth III's body was placed carefully in a heavy lead-lined coffin, not to honor the majesty of a queen, but to control what mortal eyes could not see: the smell of death, the swelling and impending rupture of a body silently decaying. The coffin was a last bastion, not against enemies, but against the very nature of death, something no monarchy could hold back. When all the preparations were complete, the red velvet coffin was loaded onto a large boat and floated silently down the murky Thames. There were no trumpets, no fireworks, no celebrations. Only a long gray cloud hung over the water, reflecting the silent grief of a nation mourning the last Tudor ruler. Thousands of people stood along the riverbanks, heads bowed, eyes gazing into the distance as if they all knew they were witnessing the end of an era and the beginning of an indescribable silence. But there was something in the air that was not quite right. The attendants standing near the coffin began to whisper about a strange scent. A sweet, strong, indescribable scent. It was not like the scent of incense or funeral incense. It was the scent of cinnamon mixed with myrrh of flesh seeping through the smallest cracks that lead could not completely seal. The scent drifted with the wind, dissolved into the air, and then filtered through the thousands of eyes bowed in remembrance like a secret that could not be buried. No one dared to speak out loud, but everyone could sense that something was wrong. The coffin, even though it was lined with lead, even though it was stuffed with spices, could not completely resist the unpredictable effects of decomposition. Death, which seemed to be under control, was still taking place silently and fiercely within that luxurious velvet. It did not scream, did not struggle, but gently exhaled the last breaths of a body that was no longer a queen, but only decaying flesh and bones. And so, Elizabeth II's funeral, though it was a state affair, was a journey of half light and half shadow, where solemnity and fear mingled with each stroke of the oars on the murky river. The danger of the coffin breaking was never entirely removed. It rested on the fragile luck that the lead was still strong enough, that the spices were still strong enough to mask the smell of death. But the truth, as everyone knows, is that death never lies still. It is only waiting for a crack, a small crack, to prove that no power is permanent enough to imprison the brutal nature of dissolution. And so, amid the silent rolling waters, amid the gentle breeze on the surface of the Thames, that coffin carried not only the body of a queen, but also a quiet reminder that death, whether restrained by metal, covered in red velvet, or carried away with the most solemn ceremony, will still find a way to be present, silently, surely, and inevitably. In the late 19th century, as Britain entered a period of nostalgia and renewed fascination with royal history, a period in which the public imagination of the past was fueled by romantic tales, hidden secrets, and curious discoveries of antiquities, a quiet but haunting event occurred in the nation's most sacred heart, Westminster Cathedral. In the place where kings had sworn oaths and witnessed the most solemn coronations, one man decided to go deep underground into the darkness of centuries-old secrets. That man was Dean Arthur Stanley, a renowned and adventurous clergyman give it the rare privilege of opening crypts that had been sealed since the Tudor period, carrying a flickering lantern and a silent curiosity. Stanley cautiously entered the dark maze beneath the cathedral. Every stone beneath his feet seemed to contain centuries of forgotten history, and every breath he took was filled with the thick air heavy with the smell of mold and time. When he reached Elizabeth I's tomb, he was not entering a place of glory, but a place where power had crumbled, where memories were buried beneath the dust of centuries and decay. Before him was a sight that would shake even the most hardened heart. The coffin, once lined with lead and covered with red velvet, the last symbol of a great queen, had now lost its shape. The wood had rotted to powder, the red velvet embroidered with Tudor roses had discolored and frayed like rotten fabric, and the lead itself had warped and warped under the slow pressure of time and accumulated air. All that had once suggested power and royalty was now a silent fragment crushed by the very law Elizabeth had feared, most: the decay of the body after death. And in that scene, Stanley still noticed a detail that made him pause for a long time. On the surface of the broken coffin, he saw the letters E.R., short for Elizabeth Regina, still faintly appearing like the last breath of memory. The letters were not bright, not majestic, but only like a sad whisper echoing from a distant era, reminding that behind all the achievements and titles, people are still just people. No layer of velvet can keep glory forever, nor can any layer of lead completely block out death. What horrified Stanley most was the realization inside the broken coffin, Elizabeth's body was still bloated. Even after hundreds of years, the gases of decomposition continued to grow slowly, persistently, as if death had not yet let go of the woman who had once been the symbol of an entire dynasty. The body, once stuffed with spices to prevent decay, was now living proof of the futility of all efforts to fight against nature. The coffin was no longer a resting place, but a leaking pressure chamber, silently waiting for a crack to release what was trapped inside. The sight not only silenced Stanley, but also engraved in his mind a truth that no one wants to face, that death does not stop when one loses one's breath, but continues to happen, silently in the dark and sometimes still causing fear, even after centuries have passed. Stepping out of that tomb, Stanley did not bring with him treasures or glorious stories, but a vague, haunting, and very human feeling that no matter how great we are, each of us will eventually return to dust and silence. And sometimes that silence is the most resounding thing in history. In the dense space of the crypt beneath Westminster Cathedral, where the light was only a dim streak from Dean Stanley's lantern, a surprising truth emerged quietly but dramatically. Right above the bloated and rotting body of Elizabeth, lying there silently and heavily, was the coffin of the person who had been her most formidable opponent in life, Mary, her half-sister, and also her uncompromising political enemy. This was no longer simply an archaeological discovery, but a chilling twist of history, where two women who had torn a country apart with their struggles for power, blood, and faith now lay on top of each other in the same narrow tomb chamber, amidst the cold of stone and the stench of decay. It is hard to imagine a more bitter tragedy. Elizabeth and Mary, two names that once held the breath of Europe, are now placed side by side, not as living symbols, but as decaying limbs with no political weight, no more luster, only slow and cruel decomposition. In their lives, they had fought for the throne, for faith, for hatred, and the existence of one always seemed to mean the end of the other. Mary, a Catholic, burned Protestants alive to defend what she believed was the way of God. Elizabeth, an Anglican, signed Mary's death warrant to defend her throne and the peace of her kingdom. Between them, there was no reconciliation, only a history of blood betrayal and the price of power. And yet, ironically, after all, it was time, something neither of them could control, that arranged for them to lie peacefully in the same grave. No apologies, no compromises. Just cold stone, the air thick with the smell of decay, and an eerie silence. Death, once again, did not choose sides. It simply gathered everyone together, putting them on the same level, even if in life they had pushed each other into the fire or the prison. That space, cramped, smelly, and dark, was like a final prison, a place from which neither Elizabeth nor Mary could escape, a place where old accusations were no longer valid, where both were doomed to silence, to rot, and to dissolve into darkness. If one believed in reincarnation, perhaps this place was the depths of punishment. Not by fire, but by eternal imprisonment next to the person one hated most, with nothing to cover them, nothing to distinguish them except the crumbling coffin and the historical memories buried with their bones. The image of the two queens lying side by side in silent decay is not only a shocking detail, but also a strangely powerful symbol. It speaks of the absolute cruelty of time, speaks of the meaninglessness of power once the breath is gone, and speaks of a cold but profound truth, that every feud, every war will eventually end in a layer of dust covering each other in a dark corner that no one wants to remember, but no one can avoid. It is a place where glory and hatred, fame and failure all melt into a gray color of sand, leaving behind a silent whisper. That history never ends with a full stop, but always continues silently in the dark, under the feet of those who walk, without knowing what lies beneath their stone. In the end, when all the lights have gone out, all the bells have rung for the last time, and all the solemnities have faded into the past, what remains of the story of Elizabeth Lawrence is not the glorious victories, the maps of the expanding empire, or the poems praising her as a goddess, but the naked, silent, absolute truth that despite having ruled a golden age, despite having made the kings of Europe tremble before her, Elizabeth could not escape the laws of natural decay like anyone else who was born and died. Her body, once draped in rich silks wrapped in majesty and divinity, eventually fell apart, swollen, and left permanent stains of the red velvet that had once been a symbol of royalty. The lead warped, the fabric rotted, and the smell of death still seeped through the cracks of Westminster Abbey, a small but insistent whisper that no one, not even one who had once stood at the pinnacle of power, could escape the patient and silent hand of time. Glory in the face of death is but a layer of paint on an old canvas. It may live on in history books, it may appear in portraits with proud eyes, it may become the subject of famous plays, but it cannot stop the body from rotting. Elizabeth's tomb, built of white marble carved with exquisite carvings, once a symbol of an empire, has become a silent reminder of the ultimate limits of humanity. It is no longer a place to celebrate greatness, but a monument to a simple truth that all great heights eventually fall into the abyss of oblivion. Beneath the ground in the suffocating silence, Elizabeth's tomb is not just the burial of a person, but the preservation of an eternal message. A message written not in words, but in the crumbling of rotten wood, the warping of lead, the staining of fabric, and the unmistakable smell of dampness. It whispers to each generation that passes through the church, power is not eternal, beauty is not eternal, and even a queen who once ruled the seas must bow before the invisible force of time. The last image that remains in the mind is not of the statue of Elizabeth in her red cloak, standing proudly in the middle of the great hall, but of a gloomy, shadowy tomb, where every velvet has rotted, where every stick of incense now has only the lingering smell of decay. It is a place where silence is not a symbol of peace, but the echo of a life gone, leaving behind a handful of dust that tells a story, and a layer of stone that keeps secrets. And when we close the story, what haunts us most is not its corruption, but its absolute fairness. Unbiased, unforgiving, unbridled by thrones or fame. Death and time, like two silent gatekeepers, still stand there guarding every grave, whether it is an anonymous person or a queen named Elizabeth Regina. And that perhaps is her greatest legacy, not just in history, but in the fragility of human life.